All right, thanks for joining. Today, the topic is ego definition and the heart center. And it's my goal to really convey the magnitude of the principle of ego, as well as how to analyze the defined and the undefined ego. And just to understand better what is the heart of humanity, the beating heart of the human, and the heart of our community, and and just how we understand these things. So, to begin with, I really want to convey that the dimension of ego is a principle. And you'll find very often that the human design body graph is a sort of microcosm of what exists in the macrocosm of the Maya. And that there are nuances, for instance, the defined versus undefined ego, but that these are configurations of an individual and in their potential to differentiate, but that these configurations actually hearken from something much larger, which is a universal subjective experience. So I'm really not overstating it when I say that ego is a dimension, that it's actually a dimension, that there's a fundamental principle of ego. It's the principle of standing up for yourself, of having a backbone, of resisting the homogenizing influence from others, of resisting interference from others. If we were to take away this principle of ego, the whole world would be sheep. And as Ra liked to say, we're in the wolf business. So whether you have a defined ego or not, following your strategy and authority is about standing up for who you are as a person. So everyone who engages in human design in some way is taking part in this fundamental aspect of reality that says, if you're not going to be like everyone else, you're going to have to take a stand. And if you have an undefined ego, you're taking a stand still through your authority. It's not about whether you have the willpower to take a stand. It's simply a fundamental question of being alive on this plane. You'll see that the ego center, the heart center, relates both to the muscle of the heart as well as the stomach, among other glands and organs. And part of this connection to the heart and the stomach can be found in our language. Do you have the stomach for it? Do you have the heart for it? Do you have the stomach for what we call in human design enlightened selfishness? Even without human design, even without that selfishness that says, I am going to follow my strategy and authority, even if it is difficult to stomach sometimes. Even without that, there are these fundamental aspects of being alive that rely on the death of other animals. The energy usage that destroys the environment. It's not that we can't become more efficient at protecting the environment and harvesting energy from it, but that's a collective game. No matter how good we get at not harming the environment, not harming other animals, we become vegan, all of these things, we still ultimately have a dimension of our being that survives through exploitation, through domination, through all of these things that are so hard to stomach. Meat eating, it's on its way out, sure, but meat eating is literally saying, I will live because another creature died. I will live because another life ended. Electricity the vast amount of damage we've done to our environment just to have electricity. But it's necessary for our phase in the evolution of consciousness, because at this step in the evolution of consciousness, we need the internet. We need the digital. And the massive environmental destruction that comes with the digital. Can you stomach it? Do you have the heart for it? This is the dimension of ego that is a fundamental aspect of life. Again, if we eliminated this dimension, no one would stand up. Everyone would allow themselves to be controlled. If one person had this dimension of ego and nobody else did, that person would be the king of the world, because they would be the only one who says no. And so regardless of whether you have a defined ego or not, I just want you to appreciate how incredible it is that you are in human design, which is a system that brings you to your own inner authority, which is fundamentally putting you at odds with the world. How special that is to stand up against the world and say no. How incredible that is to be 1 against 8 billion. I mean, yes, there is a group of human design people, but we are each alone in our experiment, and we are alone with our authority. We cannot turn to someone else to tell us what we should do, what decision we should make. And to be so alone, you and your decision making, you against the world. Right? And really about resisting control. It's saying, I won't be controlled by someone else. I won't be controlled by my doctor. I won't be controlled by my parents or by my son or daughter. I won't be controlled by my brothers and sisters or my employees or my employer. I mean, these are all mechanisms whereby we are told what we should do, who we should be, and without the principle of ego, and again, this has nothing to do with your body graph, simply this aspect of what it is to be a human, we would just do what we are told. And so instead, we each participate in discovering what happens when we don't do what we are told. And one of the things that happens is we are tested. Our mettle is tested. Our stomachs are tested. Do we have a stomach for it? Our hearts are tested. Do we have the heart for it? Our hearts are weighed, and they'd better be as light as a feather. So you see that the ego has a deep connection to our material plane. And I say material because it has to do with our survival. It has to do, even in a more fundamental way, with our survival than the spleen. If you look at the development of the human fetus, the ego center comes before the spleen. An interesting point there. And because it has to do with the material, it has to do with finite resources. So we begin to understand that the ego is there to claim the right to possess, to own. That ownership comes from the ego. Michaud said that we have properties, and he used the term properties in an intentionally ambiguous way. My properties. What are my properties? I have brown hair, I have blue eyes, I have, and so on. But also my properties in the sense of my possessions, my belongings. What properties belong to me? And this is the realm of the ego. It's like we have 2 identity centers. One which is the true center, the G center, the spiritual identity, or the identity of the spirit self, the identity of the true I am, which is not qualified. It is simply I am me. I am. Even I am spirit. I am something bigger than me. And then there's this false center, as Osho called it. There are some valid criticisms of Osho, and his practices, I'm sure, were for better and worse. Yet he had some profound insights, and Osho called the ego the false center. And the way he described it is very much as we understand it in human design, which is that it is a secondary seat of identity. It is the possessive identity, the identity of ownership, and the identity of my properties in both senses of the term. Patriotism, chauvinism, I am a man, I am an American, right? These kinds of categories, these tribal groups that we can belong to, that are not who we really are, fundamentally, not as spirit self.
A social identity.
Right, a social identity that has a social cachet, that has a social value. And so the ego possesses, and it takes just as much ownership of my properties in the sense of the attributes of myself as it does in supposed ownership of what it surrounds itself with, its trappings. My home, my wife, my car. You want to talk about objectification and quantification of value. And yet that's only part of it.
Can I share something?
Please.
Our friend Von Paul has an interesting flip on that where he uses my almost in the sense of, like, if he's talking about my wife or something, he's almost saying like my preferred person, the one that I, it's like more like a property of my life than it is my property, like ownership, so there's this, it gets back to that same dual meaning of property and this sense of like not asserting ownership over something that you have, but the one that you defer to and the one that you relate to, or the one like almost like an object of worship or something, or like an area of interest. Or
right, when I say my God that I pray to,
or
I'm not
people.
saying that I own the God, or my people that I serve, my country that I serve. I mean, the thing is, there is an ambiguity here, and as we will see, it's part of the health or lack of health of the defined ego, whether they are appreciating the intrinsic value and the intrinsic reward for what they have given, and whether they are appreciating the gifts that they are given back with gratitude, or if there's an unhealthy ego that is quantifying and translating into a commodified or even a social currency of clout, of prestige, of status and rank, and so on. And it's the undefined ego's role in its developing wisdom to know the difference. So this deep materialism of the principle of ego, it has to do with the survival not only of oneself, but one's people, one's tribe. The ego is very tribal. And there's no collective circuitry in the ego. So the ego has us and them, but not universal we. When the ego says we, it means us. It never means we humans. Or if it does, it excludes those others as subhuman. You can see that the principle of ego can be quite hard to stomach. It's the principle of control. It's the principle of designing systems of control. It's the principle of separating us from them. And it does it all in the name of fairness. Justice, retribution, trust, betrayal, revenge. These are all aspects of the ego. And these are tribal things. James Hillman wrote an essay on betrayal. And in this essay, he points out the simple fact that a stranger can't betray you. You must trust someone before they can betray you, and the more you trust them, the deeper the betrayal, even if the betrayal is slight from an outside observer.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see that this is the law of the tribe. The law of the tribe is loyalty no matter what, support no matter what. Mm-hmm. If you're tribally bonded to someone, if you are loyal to them, they could go to jail. You believe they're innocent, whether or not they are innocent. You petition to get them released, whether or not they deserve it. So the fairness of the tribe is quite skewed. And it's something that is also hard to stomach. So much of the injustice in the world is hard to stomach. And again, just as I was saying earlier, that the healthy defined ego has a healthy sense of value, whereas the unhealthy defined ego is going to translate and commodify value into currency and things like this. And it's the role of the undefined ego to know the difference. Similarly, the healthy ego will be just, will be fair, will be reasonable. An interesting keynote that is not often associated with the ego, but as we'll see in a moment, does have a connection. So this notion of fairness is really a question of the values of a particular social group. And in this sense, the postmodernists and post-structuralist philosophers are right, in that, in some sense, there is no universal subject. We must historicize. We must look at the historical context which a value system emerges in. The collective is there for the universal subject, and the collective's version of fairness is that everyone gets a fair chance, that no matter who you are, you have equal access. So the collective conflates fairness with equality. But it's up to the tribe to determine what they consider fair. And this very much is a cultural, historical creation. That doesn't mean it's not valid, by the way. The collective tries to invalidate it by saying, look, one tribe says this is fair and the other says that is fair and they can't agree, therefore they're both wrong. The only thing that's really fair is that everybody gets a chance. But it's not true. Tribal values are here to establish fairness, true fairness. And they are here to enforce justice. And so you can see how part of the role of the ego is to determine what's fair and what is a valid reward. There is something about the ego that is validating. The undefined ego can be seeking the validation of others. Well, the defined ego can too. It's just that the undefined ego doesn't know what to do with it. It's trying to convert it into the, I guess you could say, currency of some point system. Is trying to quantify it and say, look, I got more validation than you, you know. And it has to develop its wisdom to actually understand what to do with validation, because it doesn't necessarily know how to convert that validation into a life force energy in the way that the defined ego does. But you can see that something about the ego has to do with this validating process. And the ego is also here to stand up against the idea that we should perpetually work. We wouldn't have a 40-hour work week without the principle of the ego and the defined egos who are the emissaries of this principle in the Maya. The ego works, it just works temporarily. It works so it can rest. It works once so it can profit forever. Again, this is the notion of ownership. If you don't have ownership, you can be rewarded for your work, but you can never own the fruits of your labor to then later sell and profit from the fruits of your labor. This has come to the point now of intellectual property. There's an idea. A defined ego must have come up with intellectual property. No undefined ego would say, I'm copywriting this idea. The defined ego is working so that it may experience the rewards of its work the same way that the lion hunts for 2 hours a day. And something that the defined ego may relate to is that deep sense of peace and success that they feel. The ego only having manifestor and projected channels. When they have succeeded, when they have made an impact, when they have done something of value that then allows them to rest and accept the rewards for what they have done. And this is something that the undefined ego can have so much difficulty with until it learns to actually allow itself to be rewarded, or it learns how to accept the reward without converting it into narcissistic supply. The ego is a real question of self-esteem, too much or too little, and the undefined ego has both at once. Which is not to say that the defined ego can't have issues in that regard, only that there is a mechanism at work for the defined ego. They do good, they are rewarded, they convert that reward into life force energy, and they gain in vitality. They are scolded, they are criticized, they are put down, their life force energy diminishes, and you see them wilt and wither before your eyes. But the undefined ego doesn't know what to do with these things, so it's continually over and under shooting. It's continually saying, I don't deserve this, which has a double meaning. I don't deserve this gift you're giving me. I'm not good enough to receive this reward, and I don't deserve this way you are treating me. I deserve so much better than how I am treated by the world. And so the undefined ego sings its song, I don't deserve this, with its double meaning, both under and overshooting its esteem, because it has no proper sense of value. It has to develop the wisdom of who is properly evaluating or not. And the ego can be so proud, which is not a bad thing. The healthy ego can have a healthy pride. Indeed, Carl Jung pointed out how damaging it can be to have such a negative sense of one's people. He pointed out, for instance, the German shadow after World War II, which was this tremendous shame of how they had acted. And that this shame, on the contrary of what would be an imagined necessary retributive factor to help them grow, was actually stunting their growth. That fundamentally, if you are ashamed of your people and you identify with a shameful people, it stunts your growth. So the rest of the European and global communities, enforcing this shame, think that they are encouraging the growth of the German people, forcing them to confront their shadow, but it was quite the opposite. It was stunting them in a sort of dramatized self-flagellation. And it shows how the true confrontation of the shadow is asking you, can you stomach your shadow? Can you still be proud of yourself, knowing what atrocities your ancestors have committed? That is the challenge. Can you still be proud of your work, proud of your being, knowing the terrors that have been committed by your people? Because if you can't, then you go into a dramatized self-flagellation that amounts to nothing more than stunted growth, the inability to overcome a historical moment because you can't stomach it. It's a way of refusing to accept it rather than actually accepting it. So at a fundamental level, we need to be proud of what we're doing. We need to think that we are doing, not even think, but feel that we are doing more good than evil. If we fundamentally believe that we are doing more harm than good, that we are not a fundamentally good person, that we are not fundamentally contributing to the world in some sum total positive way, we don't get very far in this world. We don't get very far towards fulfilling our purpose in this life. And so the ego is so easily maligned, both correctly and incorrectly. It's so easy to see the damage of this principle of ego, of selfishness, of narcissism. And yet, the solution is not to throw it away. Again, this is the wolf business. We have to understand that trying to get rid of it is also it. Osho had an interesting riff that the ego that says it's dropping the ego is the subtlest form of ego. Now, when he talks about the ego, he is more specifically talking about what we would call the not-self of the ego, the mental decision-making that enforces proving and identifying with something that gives me value as a compensation for not having a sense of true inner value. But what he says is valid. We could translate it by saying the mind that says it's dropping the mind is the subtlest form of mind. That it's not enough to foreclose on this entire dimension of our lived life. And in fact, we have a name in psychoanalysis for what this foreclosure is. It is called disavowal. And you will see that if we understand the ego as this principle of I am that identifies with certain categories and certain properties, that the disavowal is saying, I am not the kind of person that would do that. It's what Freud called repression. Freud said, we are capable of far greater and far worse things than we know. That is, we have greater acts of heroism and greater acts of villainy in our range as human beings than we can accept. I'm not the kind of person who would do that. I'm not the kind of person who would say that. I'm the kind of person you can trust, right? These are kind of fundamental aspects of our identity. Not the identity of the spirit self, the identity of the ego as the seat of who I think I am. James Hillman wrote an essay, The Thought of the Heart. And he did something wonderful in this essay, which is he gave a mythopoetic and archetypal context for the development of our conceptions of the heart in contemporary Western culture. And what he points out is that the heart was not traditionally seen as the source of love or the heart shape of the Disney movie, hearts in my eyes. That actually, for a period of the development of philosophy and thought, the heart was where we thought from. We would think with our hearts. And this gets to another aspect of the heart, of the ego, which is that it is the center of reason. It's no coincidence that as we entered into the global cycle of the Cross of Planning in 1610, a cycle we are still in, by the way, until 2027, that cycle, the Cross of Planning, has a defined ego. 3740 is part of that cycle cross. Now, this does not mean everyone who is born during this time has a defined ego. It simply means the background frequency that is conditioning all of us for this time in the global cycles is one where the ego is in the program. And the ego being in the program shows us that this is an age of reason, that the so-called Enlightenment philosophers, Kant and so on, who developed our contemporary rationalist approaches, even the scientific revolution, that all of this was in the program, and in some sense has to do with this principle of ego acting in this stage of human evolution to enforce, if not reasonableness, because we know people can be very unreasonable, at least the confrontation of different regiments or even different registers of reason that compete with each other. And that this is very much what the Colosseum of philosophy has. Various contenders, each with their regimes of reason, arguing that their version of reason is the most reasonable, and having to prove it to each other. This is the age of proof. What is the scientific revolution if not the demand for proof? Prove it. So this is very much a part of our historical moment of these past 400 years. The time when humans demanded proof.
Show me.
Yeah. Now I want to talk a little about the undefined ego. Let's just go a couple slides here. So the heart center overall, from almost 18 million charts calculated from 1781 to 2027, is a little over 1/3 defined. For certain periods of time, as much as 45 or 46% defined. Wow. But overall, taken as a whole, with the fluctuations of definition, 37.4% defined, 62.6% undefined. Furthermore, 22.3%, a fifth, wow, of all rave charts have no activations in the heart center.
So nothing pointing at it either?
No, okay. That's simply in the heart center.
So open.
Yes, completely open heart center. Ah, it's so small, isn't it? That small muscle that makes everything work. With 4 gates in the ego, 1 channel to the throat, 1 channel to the G center, 1 channel to the spleen, 1 channel to the solar plexus. Only 1 center has less gates, the head center. And yet the ego is so complex. Its gates are so multivalent and connected to different aspects of our biology. And thank you to Sarah Mendoza for this. This is a wonderful image with the 2 Fridas by Frida Kahlo, stylized in the backdrop, and you can see Frida's hearts here. We will go into the values of the gates in the second portion after our break. And this is what Ra wrote of the heart center in the Black Book. It's always interesting to see where he began. Ego, zeal, and passion operating through the thymus gland. And it is a motor center. It drives action in the world. And so much action is taken because of the ego.
Isn't the thymus, that's part of his ego definition, right? Isn't that 26?
Yeah, when we look at the biological associations of the gates, the thymus gland and the endocrine system is implicated in gate 26. Let's start with the defined ego. So we know that the ego as a principle is here to work with the material plane, and that it's related to such areas as self-esteem. With the undefined ego, there can be tremendous issues around self-esteem, around proper evaluation of oneself, and even how to take a compliment, how to give a compliment, how to experience this entire world of gift and giving and receiving, earning, working, being rewarded for work, ownership, all of these areas that the undefined ego can be so foolish, and it can lead through its not self to so much suffering, such a tremendous suffering. And that suffering is really through the not self, the mental decision making. So that self-esteem, it can be so painful for the undefined ego to question its value, or to feel less than, to be put down, to be told they're not good enough, to be told they need to improve, to be told they're not trusted, they don't have the capacity, they have no discipline, they have no self-control. All of these things that can torment the undefined ego, that can lead to such a neurotic complex in the undefined ego, and can lead them to making mental decisions that can dominate their entire life, such that they won't do anything that does not in some way prove their value or prove their worth. It can control the person so fully. And yet, it is not a life force energy for the undefined ego. The channels are the life force energy. And so no matter how low the self-esteem gets for an undefined ego, the result is the pain and suffering of the mind. The result is the pain and suffering of the not-self. The result is that their decision-making process is controlled by the not-self mechanism of trying to prove. Coping mechanisms, defense mechanisms, layers of mental rationalizations about why they have to prove themselves, why they aren't good enough and have to do something about it. So their entire life is taken over by this not-self decision-making process, and yet it is not their life force. The defined ego is the one that actually withers when they have low self-esteem. They're the one for whom that self-esteem is translated to their vitality. So a defined ego is more vital when their ego is healthy, when their channels are being recognized or at peace, when they are being rewarded, when they are being appreciated, when they are being cared for, when they are being nurtured, when they are being appreciated for nurturing others, when they are being supported. when they are having their needs met, support and need these fundamental aspects of the tribe. And that actually gives them vitality. So no matter how bad it is for the undefined ego in their pain and suffering of the not-self, the defined ego has a direct expression of their self-esteem in their life force energy itself. The vitality of the defined ego person is directly related to this. You don't see an undefined ego person wither when they're scolded, when they're given a withering, disapproving look. Typically, they amplify and counter-amplify and counter-threaten and all of these things. So the defined ego can only be healthy when it is nurtured, when it is fed, when it is rewarded. You catch more flies with honey than vinegar with the defined ego. If you're working with them and they're not doing something you expected them to do, and the work's not getting done, and you say, hey, I thought that was going to get done. Oh, they just added a week to it. Right? But if you appreciate what they've done, truly, which is something that the undefined ego, by the way, has a hard time doing as well. Just as it has a hard time taking a compliment, it has a hard time giving a real compliment. Right? This is why defined egos can have such a easy time getting along with each other, even though where we are defined is somewhat invisible, and where we have the same channel as someone else, what we call companionship, is invisible. It still acts as an invisible glue because there's the same mechanism at work. Any defined ego person with another defined ego knows that the heart needs to be nourished, that the heart can be damaged, can be hurt, in a way that the undefined ego sometimes doesn't realize, that they can have a blind spot around. See, the psychoanalysts knew something about the ego. They knew a lot, actually. And they knew that it is related to what we call the heart, when they called heartbreak, by the technical term, narcissistic wounding. The solar plexus can't be heartbroken. The ego, when you identify with another, when you are loyal to them and expect them to be loyal to you, and that betrayal not only hurts you because they left, it hurts you because you left. The part of you that you invested in them left. The psychoanalysts distinguish between what they call primary and secondary narcissism. These are terms developed by Freud. And primary narcissism is not unhealthy. It is not what we would call narcissistic personality disorder. It is not the Gordon Gekko 80s Wall Street narcissism. Mm-hmm. It is the primary narcissism of what we might call primary self-esteem, the fundamental belief that one is good, the self-affirming, self-validating sense of goodness that needs no external validation. And that primary narcissism is so important for the healthy operating of the organism. The secondary narcissism is surplus narcissism, is a currency that has been deemed narcissistic supply. The conversion of validation into a currency that goes beyond the self-validation and the self-affirmation of accepting that one is good. And you can see how both the defined and the undefined ego can have such a problem coming into human design because of these issues around validation. That the undefined ego can be so caught in its not self strategy of trying to prove its worth that it's seeking validation from the person it asks for a reading. So when you're giving a reading to somebody and they have an undefined ego and they're coming to you, oftentimes they're looking for your approval. And the difficulty is that you're bringing them back to their inner authority, to where they are the only one who can approve or disapprove. You're helping them develop the stomach for what it is to have nobody to turn to tell them if they made the right decision or not. And yet the defined ego can also have a problem coming into human design. And their problem is they can misinterpret your attempt to bring them to their inner authority as an attempt to wrest control from them. They can misinterpret that as you competing with them or interfering with them or trying to control them. So there can be a real defense mechanism of, don't tell me what to do. Well, I'm telling you how to get in touch with an inner mechanism such that you will only ever follow your own inner truth. And yet the defined ego is so on guard against threat that it can be so hard to reach them, so hard to get through to them. Now, the life force energy of the ego is so wrapped up for the defined ego in their self-esteem that when they have a healthy sense of self-esteem, they have a healthy ego, they have a healthy vitality. It's something to realize that when you have a channel, there is a real connection between the operating of that channel and your overall health and your overall how vital you are as a person. And so if you have a defined ego and you are not being rewarded for what you're doing, it's actually diminishing your health. The life force energy of the defined ego can diminish when it is not appreciated, not recognized in the case of the projected channels, scolded, put down, or made to feel unworthy. When dealing with the defined ego, ask yourself if it's more important to be right or if you can accept them. Can we turn off that?
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
I have my Do Not Disturb on, so if we can just turn off. So ask yourself if it's more important to be right or if you can accept them, mistakes and all, without shaming, blaming, or putting them down. Because so often in a disagreement, especially from an undefined ego person in interaction with a defined ego, they can be amplifying that sense of threat and amplifying that sense of don't mess with me and trying to prove that they are right. And they end up proving they're right, but they end up shaming, blaming, and putting down the defined ego person. So just ask yourself in your dealings with the defined ego, is it really important for you to prove them wrong? Are you really here to prove them wrong with your undefined ego? Now, of course, there are these cases where two defined egos will go head to head. And that's something where they're going to have to reach some sort of either agreement or impasse. Being reasonable, it's really a test of if they can agree on what is reasonable, if they can agree to disagree. But oftentimes, the undefined ego can't even agree to disagree. It disagrees to disagree with the other and continues to fight and continues to amplify and continues to try to prove long after the point of reason. If you have a defined ego, you may bring out sensitivities in others who will amplify your own energy. Do not disavow your own ego. Allow for healthy expression of ego. Competition, self-deprecating humor, and expressions of what you consider fair and unfair, as well as asking for support and having your needs met. Now, I want to take a short break. At the top of the hour, we'll come back for the undefined ego, and then we're going to look at some of the gates in the ego. Thank you all for joining today, and I see less comments in the chat than we had with the solar plexus, which is perhaps validating my assumption that this was a good second and not a first class.
There's more to ruminate on here.
Well, and yeah, there's more to ruminate on, and it can also just be such a heavy topic that when we're talking about something so fundamental and, in some sense, so precious, and simultaneously so ferocious and so vulnerable as the ego. All right, we'll take a break, and we'll be back at the top of the hour. Thank you all for joining. All right, let's continue. I'll just wait a moment for Mike, but I want to, I'll go over what we're going to talk about in the remaining portion here. So we will take a look at the undefined ego. And this is really where you're going to really have the most to give people who come to you for human design readings. I'll just say that it can be such a touchy, sensitive area that it really is important to handle with care. But so many that have an undefined ego have such a dilemma there that when people come to you for readings, as we've seen, 2/3 of the people that come to you are going to have this really sensitive point, and it's not always most effective to start there. It can be so crucial to them, and yet it's important to have a sense for when someone is actually ready to go on that journey. There's also going to be cases, for instance, with split definition where the bridging gates become a more integral part of the not-self construct than the centers. So it's not only that if somebody has an undefined ego, that's going to be the core of their not-self, and yet that is such a sensitive point that it is something that you will want to talk about at some point. I typically do go into it with the first reading, and yet somebody who is coming into human design with an undefined ego can certainly be very sensitive in that area. And then the other thing, just to, as I kind of said before, there can be such a desire to have your validation, and there's such a temptation as a human design analyst to allow them to give you their authority, and that's not what you're here to do. You're here to redirect them to their own authority and to empower them. That's not an easy task. So, okay, we'll continue in just a moment. I'm going to turn off the lights. All right, let's continue, and I'm just going to continue with the undefined ego. All right. There's a not-self hierarchy, which is the hierarchy of the strength of the centers. And although we saw last week with the solar plexus that in the hierarchy of authority, the solar plexus, if defined, is always the authority. So in some sense, it is the strongest center. When it comes to the not-self, the solar plexus is actually the second strongest. A close second, by the way, but still not the essential foundation of the not-self. That is the heart center. What do I mean when I say the foundation of the not-self? That if we were to look at somebody who has all 9 centers undefined, a reflector, what we would first see and notice about them is actually the outermost layer of the not-self. That outermost layer being the throat center. And we would see, here's somebody who we notice they're able to get attention, or they're trying. Maybe they're not getting attention, but they're contending with that. They're saying, hey, 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 right? And then we might notice the next layer down. We might notice the sacral center. Here's somebody who is available or doesn't know if they're available or not, so we can condition them to be available. Here's somebody who will work for us, right? And it keeps going. Well, at the very deepest of this not-self hierarchy is the heart center. And that's something that people don't necessarily notice. You don't necessarily look at somebody with an undefined heart and say, well, there's somebody who has a self-esteem problem. Or there's somebody who is dealing with these heart issues, trying to prove themselves and so on. It's not obvious. And yet it is such a deep, fundamental aspect of their decision-making process. The undefined ego that is not living their design is going to only really live for the approval of others. They're going to live for the eyes of others. They're going to live to impress. They're going to live to prove. They're going to prove what they can do. I mean, I heard about this guy, what's his name? Lex Friedman, who was doing a test to see how many pull-ups he could do. And he was doing 150 pull-ups a day. And I said to myself, here's a guy with an undefined ego. Sure enough, undefined ego. He was trying to prove his value, trying to prove in a competitive landscape. But the deconditioning of the undefined ego is so difficult because it doesn't stop when you stop trying to prove. That's an incredible moment of awakening. Someone who has an undefined ego who comes into human design, and you can give them such a gift if you can really get through to them. It's not easy to do, but it's a momentous occasion if you can actually convey to them that they don't have to prove. I don't mean to diminish this step in any way, but it's not the end, it's the beginning. See, if you have an undefined ego, there's a fundamental question you are wrestling with, which is whether the sum total of your output balances the books against the total of your input. Phrased another way, do I really deserve to live? Am I really just taking up space? Carl Jung pointed out the high rates of suicide and depression among artists. And his explanation for this is that all of us unconsciously keep track of how we are supported in this sort of psychic ledger. And we are all supported, even the most underprivileged, even the most abandoned children. The fact of their survival already indicates that someone, somewhere supported them, that society in some way allowed them to survive, nourished them, nurtured them, so that all of us are supported by our families, by our communities. And if you give back in a so-called blue-collar job, picking up the trash, delivering the mail, you're guaranteed to have given back. Your gift balances the books. But if you're a creative individual, you're gambling. You're taking a risk that what you're creating might not have value. You're betting on a future that may never come. And when it doesn't, the weight of all you have taken weighs on you heavily. And so the undefined ego can have such a complex around this fundamental question of whether they deserve to live, of whether they're fundamentally good, of whether at a deep level they are actually valid as a human being or invalid, a mistake. And so there's this deep pain and suffering of the undefined ego as the not-self, which is an unfillable void that they can spend their entire life compensating for through self-improvement, demonstration of loyalty, making promises, trying to appear trustworthy, trying to develop the capacity, and so on. Trying to have self-control. And in other words, proving. And if we look at what the ego feels at such a fundamental level, it is threat. It is attuned to threat. This is its relation to the fundamental survival instinct. It's attuned to threat, and it is what is here to counter threat. And you will see that some defined ego people can be very intimidating, can feel very threatening for the undefined ego. The undefined ego person can feel like they are in a world that is foreign and threatening and scary, not just like an undefined spleen that's afraid of what might happen, but the undefined ego that is sensitive to being found out as being a fake. And this is even a deeper fake than the solar plexus. We've seen that the solar plexus can have such an imposter syndrome around how it presents itself, or rather, it can at least be an imposter. But imposter syndrome proper belongs to the ego. Because you see, there's a key difference here. That undefined solar plexus can hide who they really are through the belief that the other can't handle the truth, through the belief that they have to present themselves a certain way, and so on. They can really hide what they're feeling, hide their true values and their opinions, and so on. But when you have an undefined ego and you really wake up to how it's been controlling your life and the not-self strategies that have made the decisions in your life, it's no longer this idea that you're hiding your values from others. It's this awakening to the fact that your values themselves were false, that what you considered important was not important, that your entire life was built on sand, was built on a sort of narcissistic supply you gained from translating the legitimate, good, healthy expressions of giving and gratitude into an unhealthy currency of social cachet, of clout. So that's why I say that the journey of the undefined ego does not stop when it stops proving. It stops, well, it never really stops, but it at least reaches its next milestone when it can not only go through the threshold of no longer proving, but re-enter into life with a renewed attitude toward all of these activities that were previously only used as currency. It's like if you read self-help literature and you hear about narcissistic personality disorder, which I think, by the way, is probably an undefined ego illness, where for someone who does not suffer from such an affliction, perhaps a healthy defined ego or an undefined ego who's conditioned with healthy attitudes and healthy values and so on, that they are able to give and receive gratitude and accept it as gratitude itself at face value. And yet the unhealthy, disordered version is to continually translate it into a game of competition, of trying to fill a void, of trying to gain some secondary thrill from basically not knowing what to do with it, and so then trying to translate it into a currency, trying to translate it into a secondary value. So that's why I say, as an undefined ego, this first step of beginning your deconditioning journey is when you stop proving, and you stop making promises, and you stop the self-improvement game, and you stop the trust me game, and all of these things. And yet, that is a point where many people end. And they foreclose on all of it. And they say, oh, before human design, I was trying to make a lot of money. Now I have an undefined ego. I realize that. I'm free from that. So I never accept money for my readings. Donate what you will. And that forecloses from having to contend with this question of value. Or they say, yeah, I used to be so obsequious, I was continually complimenting everyone with an undefined ego, just seeking their approval. Now I never compliment anyone. I don't like compliments either. They don't mean anything to me. I have an undefined ego. That's completely meaningless. That world doesn't apply to me. It's not true. The undefined ego is just dumb. It doesn't know how to give a real compliment. It doesn't know how to receive a real compliment. It doesn't know how to do something without it converting it into some alternate regime of value, some fake value system. So that is why it can be such a difficult thing to awaken to the fact that all of one's previous values were built on sand. And the desire can be then, for the undefined ego learning this about themselves, well, my castle was built of sand, I'll never build a castle again. Foreclosing on an entire part of life. Ignoring an entire part of life. No, the first step is to stop proving, but from that point on, the next step is to retrieve the real, authentic value of compliments, gifts, appreciation, rewards, earning. It's like they've spent their whole life seeking compliments, seeking validation. So then they wake up to it and they believe that's evil. And so they go about the rest of their life saying, wow, I'm so glad I found human design. It freed me from the evil of compliments. But compliments aren't evil. What's evil is the translation of the compliment into an imaginary value system. The value system of the not self that's trying to convert everything into points so that it can prove its value and prove that it's got enough points. But it's never enough, because when you're continually quantifying, you're in this world of quantification, you're completely missing out on the quality of the healthy ego, the attitude of the healthy ego, the attitude that can receive, truly receive gifts from others, and the attitude that can give, truly give, anonymously, without expectation for gaining something from it. It's like giving because you want to be seen giving. And what is it to really give? But yeah, you see the undefined ego at work in the world at large. It's not self-theme. I said last week how you can see the undefined solar plexus in the magazine checkout stand. And you see all those magazines, improve your sex life, go on your adventures. Well, what else do they say? Improve yourself. How to get solid abs. How to eat healthy. How to, and so on. And we can see that this is ego stuff. This is tribe stuff. The tribe proves what a healthy tribe it is through its abundance of food, through its banquets. Early religions, having their feasts and so on, their rites and rituals. Really, doctors are tribal. There's a collective aspect to healing, of course. I know this as a cross of healing myself. Cross which is 3 parts collective and 1 part individual. And there's no tribal in the cross of healing. But doctors, the health of the tribe, it's very important. Support, having your needs met. Are you eating enough? All of this. If you have an undefined ego, do things for yourself. It's easy to perform for the sake of proving your value, but it's hard to actually value yourself enough to give yourself rewards in a meaningful way. Now again, this is a complex thing where there can be the sort of pre-human design phase. In psychoanalysis, they call it the pre-analytic subject. The subject who lives in the imaginary and has not yet confronted the symbolic, which is to say, they live in a fantasy and they have not yet come face to face with the reality. And for this pre-analytic subject, for someone who is living in the fantasy of the not-self of the undefined ego, they may actually be giving themselves a lot of rewards, but they're not actually enjoying those rewards. They're not actually getting anything from those rewards. They're doing it because they're conditioned to do it, and they're showing off to others how much they're rewarding themselves and so on. But they're not actually rewarding themselves in a way that would matter. They're not actually honoring their strategy and authority. Maybe they have an undefined sacral and they're working 14 hours a day and they're rewarding themselves with the steak dinner, but they're not enjoying it. They're not finding the success or the peace or even the surprise. So it's one of those things where there really are phase shifts. And before that awakening to the undefined ego, there can be all of the same rewards. It's like that saying Ra loved, stupid before enlightenment, stupid after, right? You can see all the same behavior before the awakening. Then the awakening comes and there's this long process of the deconditioning where all the behavior is given up. And then you start the behavior again. But you're now starting it in a different way. It's no longer giving these surrogate values. It's no longer empowering the not-self decision-making because now you're guided by your strategy and authority.
Right.
So you're once again having the steak dinners, but now you're actually enjoying them. As you decondition from proving, also notice how hard it is to accept gifts, compliments, financial reward, and other forms of acknowledgement. Ironically, the undefined ego can crave approval as the not-self, but also have to break through barriers to accepting approval in its deconditioning process. It's kind of like craving the approval, but never really knowing how to receive it, so the approval never feeds it, is never satisfying, is never meeting those needs, and so it's a bottomless pit of approval seeking as the not-self. Whereas actually learning how to appreciate that approval can satisfy that yearning in such a deep way. As you trust your own inner decision-making process, you put out a frequency that makes others trust you. You no longer have to rely on making promises in the hopes of building trust. So, homework. Oh yeah, you like this one.
Cool.
Watch Ikiru, the 1952 film by Akira Kurosawa. Thank you, Mike, for introducing me to that film. There was also a recent remake with Bill Nighy. It's not The Science Guy, the other one.
Oh.
It's good. The remake's good. The original is incredible, and it really raises some interesting questions about what do we value and where are our values. And I think it's relevant to the question of whether we have built up false values and false conditioned values that don't actually serve us. And I think it's valid for both defined and undefined ego. And then, if you want to really see the ego in its most vicious and its most threatening, there's about a 6-minute or 8-minute scene that's very famous. And in fact, you can find a lot of different actors, famous and otherwise, who have recreated this monologue. It's a very popular scene to show off one's acting ability. I think because it speaks to something so fundamental. And that's Alec Baldwin's famous scene from Glengarry Glen Ross, the 1992 film by David Mamet. You should be able to find that on YouTube. The whole movie's good, but the scene in particular, you'll know the one when you see it, because it's very much related to the ego, and it really shows the ugly side of humanity. Now, if you have an undefined ego, your homework is to notice your relationship to the 4 ego gates. Oops. And I'll go into those in a moment. We're going to open up the discussion and then talk about the gates as well. But notice your relationship and how you feel if someone were to tell you that they don't trust you. And these four ego gates have the keynotes of stamina, capacity, guts, and nerve. There are other keynotes, and we'll go into them momentarily to describe kind of how to deconstruct these keynotes. But just noticing how you would feel. Someone says, well, I don't trust you because you don't have the capacity for that. I don't trust you because you don't have the guts to pull it off. You don't have the nerve to make that happen. You don't have the stamina, the staying power, right? This is something that can be very sensitive for the undefined ego. Reflect on your relationship to money and any potential discomfort with being highly paid for your time. And consider, if you already give paid readings and you have an undefined ego, consider raising your rates, even if it's just for one, just to see how you feel. Mm-hmm. See how you feel giving a paid reading for more money than you've charged before. Now, if you have not given a paid reading, this is the week that I would urge you to give a paid reading. Just do it. Just tell your friends, hey, I'm in a class, we have homework. Part of our homework this week is to give a paid reading and see how it feels. Now, it's not that you can't do this with a defined ego. This is just something that will get you in touch with where you're at with the undefined ego pretty quickly. Now, for the defined ego, reflect on what rewards you enjoy. These could be physical things like meals or physical affection or massage, or they could be love languages like words of affirmation, gifts, or quality time. This is something just to be in touch with and to realize that your vitality is improved when you are rewarded for what you've done. Consider what you can do once and gain reward for indefinitely. That is, what kinds of things you can invest in for your future, for your own future, as well as those you support, those you care about. But this is important. Having a defined ego, you're not here to be on the hamster wheel. You're not here to be in the rat race. The defined ego can be a projector or a manifester, but it can't be a generator unless it has a defined sacral. And if it's a defined sacral, it's not a projector or a manifester. So it's telling you something here. It's telling you that the ego has more in common with, for instance, the manifester than it does with the generator. The ego's not here to respond. It's not here for the day in, day out. Yes, you can be a generator or a manifesting generator with a defined ego, but that means that part of you is going to need to rest and enjoy the fruits of your labors. And that there's an added requirement that you don't have if you're a generator with an undefined ego. That added requirement for rest. And for investing in your future in some sense.
Yeah, they don't like paying rent. They'd rather be paying off a mortgage.
Right. The defined ego doesn't like paying rent. It likes paying off a mortgage. Absolutely. Because then it's paying towards a future. It's investing in ownership. Takeaways. Don't pressure the undefined ego to make promises or overcommit their energy. Allow them to make decisions from their authority, not from their willpower. I remember in my first year of human design, I went to an astrological convention. I was doing some human design readings there. And I did a reading for a couple. And it was quite difficult because I'd been trying to do individual readings for each of them, but the man was the one who was interested. And I kind of told him about his chart, but then I ended up doing the couple reading, and I kind of got around to the ego, and he had an undefined ego and she had a defined ego. And her big complaint, she literally said, okay, this is what I want to know. He keeps quitting smoking cigarettes and then he starts smoking again. And he always promises that he'll quit, and then he breaks his promises, and I have to push and push and push to get him to quit again. And finally he quits, but he only quits for a couple weeks and starts up again. And this is destroying our relationship. His smoking is ruining our relationship. How do I get him to keep his promises? How do I get him to quit for good? And because I was experimenting with my undefined solar plexus no longer being squeamish about confrontation, and my undefined ego being somewhat detached from any sense of threat, and she was a very threatening person, by the way, I simply said, the relationship is being destroyed by you pushing him with your willpower to exercise willpower he doesn't have. And in fact, he should never make a promise to you or anyone. And she hated that, and they didn't talk to me the rest of the event. But again, that maybe I came across scolding. The next part for the defined ego is don't scold the defined ego and expect it to respond to that. And don't expect the defined ego to respond at all. The defined ego is here to give a person a strong backbone, and it is a mistake to try to break through to them. You'll just alienate them and diminish their life force energy. Instead, reward them for their hard work. All right, and I want to open up, I guess, to a little bit of discussion, and then I do have some notes on the particular gates. I don't plan in this center's course to go through every gate of every center. That would be too much. But because there are only 4 in the ego center, and because they help tell the story of that center, I thought we could do that. Now, I also realize for those who have time commitments, if you have to drop off, no problem at all. It is half an hour after the hour, and I think we'll try to finish at the top of the hour. I know I, kind of allotted 90 minutes for these, but it seems like we need a little more time. So, any comments? Anything to start? Should we just do? I'll do questions, and then we'll look at the gates.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see what questions we have.
I'm gonna pee.
Rachel comments: defined ego children, bribes versus admonishment. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Nancy, what's the conflict dynamic for undefined versus undefined / defined versus defined ego? Well, 2 defined egos is kind of like 2 superheroes fighting. I saw that the other day. Some of you know James Alexander. He's a great human design analyst, and I have a friend who's also a defined ego, and it's really fun. The rest of us were undefined egos at the table, and it was really, seeing them fight, it's a little bit like seeing a couple dogs play really hard, and you kind of worry about them, and then someone says, no, they're fine. That's just how they play. It was a little bit, it definitely made us all nervous at the table with our undefined egos, like, are they okay? Is this okay? They're kind of like going at it in a kind of intense way where, they have their own language and they're able to communicate with each other through this language of threat and counter-threat. But the undefined egos got a little nervous around that because we would not be able to keep our cool in a heated confrontation in that way. I was just mentioning the other day with James and how everybody at the table with the undefined ego got a little bit
What's
touchy.
Happening here?
Yeah, we got a little touchy, and we got it because we saw these 2 defined egos who were kind of head to head, and it was kind of around, like, basically he had said, he's like, well, I'm going to give you a reading, but I'm going to record my reading, or not record. It's going to he's going to do it remote. He didn't want to do it in person, and she says, oh no, you'll give me a reading, but you'll do it in person.
Right.
And he goes, no, I won't. And he goes, well, then you're not going to give me a reading. And he says, well, that's okay. I'm not going to give you a reading then. Well, that's your loss. And he goes, no, that's your loss. And it's like this very intense head-to-head battle of these 2 defined egos. And we're all like looking at each other like, is this just how they flirt? Like, what is this? Is this like a mating ritual we don't understand? What's going on here? Now, the question also, so, Nancy was asking, what is it when 2 defined egos versus 2 undefined egos have conflict? Now, also, Rachel had asked earlier, and it's something that I touched on during the break in the comments, but I want to circle back on, or I kind of bookmarked to circle back, is the question of what is the difference for an undefined ego when they're around someone who has a defined ego versus another undefined ego who has an electromagnetic. Now, Mike and I have undefined egos, but we have an electromagnetic. So part of that electromagnetic that activates our ego, it's actually really hard to have a relationship with an undefined ego together. Now, I say this with the caveat that if you've entered into your relationship through strategy and authority, it's important for you to be in that relationship, period. It doesn't necessarily matter I think the more you're in human design, the more you start to see relationships the way that Black Mirror episode presents them. There's this incredible Black Mirror episode where there's an AI supercomputer in the future that matches people together. And it matches you with someone, and then when you come to them, you're just in a relationship with them. There's no choice. You're like, okay, I'm in a relationship now. And then you're both given this device that you can only unlock if you both decide to unlock it, which tells you the lifespan of the relationship. And it could be 34 minutes, or it could be 18 years, 7 months, 6 days, and 2 hours and 12 minutes. You know, it's a timer. It's a timer of the lifespan of that relationship. And it's a great conceit that they have in this episode, because what it shows, I mean, there's so many incredible possibilities here. That two people really hit it off, but they're only given 2 days together. And they're so sad to be reassigned. And then they're given 3 years with somebody else. But then, little do they know, they're matched up again after that. And they're matched up again for 40 years. You know, and it's like they needed to be with that other person to learn something, because they wouldn't have been happy having 40 years together from the beginning. They needed to be together and split up and go their separate ways and come back together. And this is just how life works. And this is really just the perspective that human design gives you. That you're in a relationship, you didn't choose to be in that relationship, you don't know how you ended up with that person, you don't know how long it's going to last. It does have a shelf life, but you don't know what it is. Neither of you, I mean, the only difference is that the two of you can't look at some device to tell you. But one day it's just over, or it's not, depending if it's 40 years or 40 minutes. You don't really know. And if it's over, it doesn't mean it's over permanently, because it could happen again later. You don't have that choice. And really, this AI, this supercomputer, is really just God. Or if you don't want to use the word God, it is the magnetic monopole on its trajectory through fractal lines of incarnational processes that have been happening since the Big Bang. And you're really just on this trajectory that your strategy and authority is directing you through, so that you get the right relationships for yourself, and you end up with the right people for you, and you leave the relationship when it's over, and you enter into the relationship when it's there. And without strategy and authority, you have people getting it backwards and staying in the relationship that's done and refusing to enter into the relationship that's there for them, and so on. So really, human design is getting you to stop interfering with your trajectory, to align you to your correct trajectory, so you end up in the right places, with the right people, having the right experiences. And it really does bring you around to this surrender to relationship. Now, that being said, if you're surrendering to a relationship that doesn't have a defined ego, or doesn't have a defined solar plexus, or doesn't have a defined G center, and so on, each of these is going to have a certain complexity to it, and it's going to have a certain, I would call it flavor, but it's almost like lack of flavor. I mean, it's the undefined ego relationship can be one of the hardest. We've all heard that trope of the one who got away and you didn't realize the value until after they were gone. And that is the trope of the relationship that has an undefined ego together. When you have a defined ego together, either because one person has the defined ego, or both do, or it's an electromagnetic, as in the case of Mike and myself, I have 26, he has 44, that is a relationship where you know the value of that person to you. And when you don't have a defined ego with that person, you don't know the value. You do not have consistent access to knowing how valuable that person is. And so they leave your life and years go by and you go, wow, that person brought so much to me. That person was such a reward to me, and I didn't realize it. I overlooked their value. I didn't accept their value. I didn't realize their value. So each of the undefined centers in a relationship can have a difficulty. It's not a death sentence for that relationship. It can be really hard to have a relationship that has an undefined solar plexus together, because there's the constant risk that one or both of you are going to be stolen away by someone else who has that defined solar plexus or has an electromagnetic that pulls one of the people away. It can be so difficult. And yet, It's not about trying to find the right relationship or good news, we have a defined center together. It's like good news, bad news, who knows? We don't really know that. And besides, I really like the French philosopher Alain Badiou, who says in his book on love, which is a great book, by the way, and highly recommended if you're a heart card of destiny like myself, if you're a lover of love. He says that love is not staring deeply into the other's eyes. It is standing side by side looking out at the world together. And so your undefined centers being your windows into the world, it's okay to have these windows if you're standing side by side. It's only when you're looking deeply into each other's eyes and expecting the other to give you that you become disappointed in them, that you wish they were different than they are. Why don't you give me this? That's not what love is about. What's wrong with you that you don't have this thing that I want? So for Mike and myself, having undefined ego and then having the activation of that, we are collaborating on basically the project of will our relationship have value or not? Can we produce value or not? Now, we actually have the 4426, which is a love gate. There are actually 3 love gate. So if you look at this image here, 3 of the 4 channels from the ego have love gates. 26 goes to 44, which is a love gate. 51 goes to 25, which is a love gate. And 40 is a love gate itself. But in the case of the 4426, it's really that we will succeed or fail. This is a projected channel. And so it has success as one of its keynotes. And on the other end is the failure that leads to bitterness. People don't often think of the projector in terms of failure as their not self theme being failure. But that's really what bitterness is. Failing at being recognized, failing at being appreciated, failing to be invited, failing to have others see any value in you. And so for Mike and myself, we have a dynamic that forces us, obligates us to succeed or fail. And if we fail, we're not going to be friends. If we fail, we're not going to be in each other's lives. Not to say you don't get both sides of the binary at different points, but overall, our ability to succeed is what brings that vibration of success, that sweetness to our connection. And if we don't succeed, then we would be developing bitterness, and we would be very bitter about each other, and bitter about how each of us have failed the other, failed to support the other, failed to meet the needs of the other. That 44, the love of success, very materialistic. It's like if you have a 4426 with someone, you'd better succeed with them. You'd better make each other rich. You'd better materially thrive with them. If you're getting married to somebody and you have a 4426 electromagnetic, you need to make a lot of money together. You can't live in poverty together the way that a 2838 could or something like that, right? So, right, the questions being, how do 2 undefined egos have conflict? Well, there's a big difference whether they're activating each other's ego or not, whether they're conditioning through that electromagnetic or not. And I guess the big difference is going to be that if you remain having an undefined ego with the other, you're probably not going to have too much conflict with them because you don't care enough. And in fact, it's the opposite problem of years later realizing how much value they brought to you, realizing how much you should have cared. And it's that one that got away, but really it's just it's invisible. You're not really bringing out those dormant qualities of each other. Whereas if you do activate each other's ego, that can be explosive. That can be totally explosive. I remember a situation with a manifester which erupted into extreme anger and actual physical violence. And really, I mean, the ego brings a lot of the ugly side of life, a lot of the violence of life, a lot of the anger of life, and so on. The solar plexus too, but the ego really, I mean, this is central to it. And I have gate 26. He has gate 26. We did not activate each other's ego, but there was a woman involved, and she had 44. And she was there, and we'd both been spending a lot of time with her independently. We were all in a band together, and it was just a recipe for disaster. And she was there for band practice, and she was really egging on this other guy and talking about the dates that she's been going on, and she'd been kind of, rejecting him, and then but spending a lot of time with both of us, and kind of playing this game, this approval game, but also this ego trip thing. And we ended up all playing, and then after the recording, and we also had a defined ego in the band who also came in, so giving it a little extra juice, a little extra defined ego energy. And afterwards, he accused me of playing over his solo, and then I got very confrontational and accused him of. It just completely erupted to where he was literally chasing me through the house, trying to physically attack me.
Right.
So you can see how the ego can be a ticking time bomb, and it can be really explosive. And even though he and I did not activate each other's egos, because there was ego activation there can be this amplified ego energy, which is not tethered. If you have definition, that definition tethers the range of expression.
Yeah.
But an untethered expression can go to an extreme that a defined ego wouldn't be capable of, or would take some sort of atomic meltdown to reach. But that bottle up and explode quality of the undefined centers is perhaps nowhere more apparent than in the ego. It's so small, but it can be so explosive. So yeah, I think to answer Nancy's question, the two undefined egos who have conflict, when there's no activation, there's not going to be anything other than the residual conditioning of other other egos, or the kind of camel hump. I mean, it really depends how full that camel hump is. But then when they do have activation together, it can actually be incredibly powerful to go into that conflict if both people with the undefined ego are able to navigate that. And that explosive anger can be curtailed and channeled, not repressed, but expressed in a healthy way. And then it can actually lead to a tremendous sense of peace, because there can be this sort of congestion that occurs. And there have been times where you and me have had that, and also my good friend Maddie. I remember laughing when I realized how healthy our friendship became every time we'd have a big blowout. And we'd be on this road trip together, and on day 6, we would finally be at a rest stop, and she'd be like, well, if you wouldn't have done this, we would have been there before. And I'd be like, but you're the one who wanted to go here, and you made this. We have this huge blowout. I mean, of course, it's not healthy for anyone to fry their nervous system with anger, right? And of course, part of that nervous system can also be the solar plexus, and there can be solar plexus congestion that has to be expunged as well. But I do think that there is something like an ego congestion that sometimes needs to be worked through when you have an undefined ego, they have an undefined ego, and the two of you have an electromagnetic together. Now, in the case of the difference, I guess the question from Rachel was the difference between having an electro with somebody versus they have a defined ego. Well, there's even going to be a further difference, which is whether you have a compromise with them or not. And that compromise can be so difficult. The compromise is where they have the whole channel and you have half. And for the person with half the channel, I mean, both will have their complaints. The person with the whole channel is probably complaining, God, I wish this person had a defined ego. Then I could just trust them to do what they say they're going to do. They're so flaky. They don't follow through, all this stuff. Although if you're following your strategy and authority, they can hang their hat on your authority because you are you are more decisive. You are actually following through, not because of a promise you made, but because you made that decision as yourself. But typically, the person with the hanging gate will have more of the complaints. I mean, both sides complain, but the one with the hanging gate, it's more of the complaint of, I have a hanging 26 and an undefined ego. I've been in a relationship with someone who has the whole 44-26. That's a dynamic where she has the whole channel, I have half the channel, and it's impossible for us to collaborate. If you look at what that channel's about, that channel that Mike and I have as collaboration, it is capitalist enterprise. It is creativity. It's let's make something and sell it to the tribe. It's Kanye West's only channel, right? This channel of surrender, a design of the transmitter. And, they're transmitting to the tribe. And so for Mike and I, we can collaborate. But in a case where I have a compromise with somebody, it looks exactly the same to me. I have the sense that we can collaborate, and yet I end up in the waiting game where the collaboration never comes. It's a mirage. That's how compromise is. The person with half the channel sees the person with the whole channel as if they had the hanging gate. And so they wait to plug into that hanging gate. And they wait, and they wait. And they're not waiting to respond. They're not waiting for the invitation. They're waiting for the expectation to be fulfilled, an expectation which is never met, that they will be able to plug in. And they never plug in. So, but I would just say, the experience of the undefined ego with the defined ego, well, that's very much part of the journey of the undefined ego in developing its wisdom, discerning between healthy and unhealthy defined egos. Who has a healthy heart? Who has an unhealthy heart? Whose heart is full of bile versus whose heart is, broad-hearted and so on. In fact, a big part of the undefined ego is to broaden their heart, to allow others to admire them, but also to allow others to criticize them. I wouldn't say it's the defined ego's job to broaden their heart as much. They are fixed in that way. But the undefined ego is here to sample a lot of different defined egos and see who's reasonable, who's unreasonable, who's fair, who's unfair, who has a healthy sense of self, of self-ownership, a healthy sense of pride, and who's fragile and overcompensating with an unhealthy pride. Pam comments, the person she has the most difficulty with at work compromises her 26. Yeah, collaboration has been impossible. That is true. And then Christine, can't collaborate. Well, that's okay. There's other ways of collaborating. And my advice for those who have compromise is for the person with the hanging gate just to treat it as if it's a domination. That is, to treat it as if the other person is just fully in charge in that way. So Amber Terry asks, can you talk about the conditioning of the defined ego? She feels like there's so much about the undefined ego, but not much on deconditioning the defined ego. As the leader in the hierarchy, it should be an important topic. As someone with a defined ego who's experienced scapegoating and other manipulation by undefined egos, mainly parents who are unaware, that greatly impacted her, and also witnessed this in others' lives and experiences, she understands it comes down to strategy and authority, but hasn't quite grasped how to verbalize this experience with others so we can learn from each other. Does anyone else have this experience? What does this process look like? Maybe a topic for the study group. Yeah, I wouldn't call it deconditioning of the defined ego. I would say the deconditioning process for people who have a defined ego, because the defined ego, it has a mechanism of life force energy, as we talked about, where that mechanism is going to operate through being able to receive reward or not, being appreciated or not, being scolded or not. The defined ego can definitely be beaten down by others, and it can diminish their life force energy by being criticized and scolded and all of these things. And especially because the defined ego is causing the amplification from undefined egos in the sense that they are going to amplify what frequency is being put out. I will say that the defined ego will have radically different experiences with undefined egos as their own frequency changes. And it's very common that you have someone with a 1949, for instance, which is a channel of jealousy and possessiveness, connects to that 3740 in that same stream, who says, I'm not jealous, but everybody's constantly jealous all the time around me. Similarly, you'll have a 2551, which is a channel of competitiveness, and they'll say, I'm not competitive, but people are continually trying to be competitive with me. And so there's this song of the defined center that the world that reflects them, the reflections they're experiencing in others, is not to their liking. And what's happening in those cases is, one, that they can be the wrong people that they're around, because no matter how good the frequency you're putting out, the wrong people are going to distort that frequency and give you a very distorted mirror of yourself. But two, that as you change, your world changes, and that one of the fundamental precepts of human design is that the resistance you meet in others is the signpost of you not living your design. So in that sense, there is no blame, not even of yourself. There's only the question of your decision making. And so when you meet resistance in others, that is your indication that you have not made decisions as yourself. That is your indication. The very fact that they are giving you resistance is telling you that you made a decision that led you to that place. And that the decisions that you have made have led your aura to put out a frequency that is reflected back to you from them. And again, it can be the most positive frequency in the world and reflected back through distortion. But it can also be the disavowed parts of ourselves that are displaced that others are now exhibiting. So often the undefined ego that's putting out aggression is because of the unchecked, displaced, disavowed aggression of the defined ego. That they say, I'm not an aggressive person, I'm not a competitive person, I don't have anger, I don't have... on and on and on. The same way that we see that the black sheep of the family is usually the undefined solar plexus in a family of defined solar plexus people. That they're the one who is the weak point giving expression to all of the shadow of the defined center. So I am very skeptical of blaming undefined centers, regardless of center. It's like blaming the projectors for the meal of sacral energy they get every day from everyone around them. And wow, that projector is annoying how they're just bouncing off the walls. Well, they're bouncing off the walls because you're a generator who isn't draining your tank every day. You're a generator who isn't putting out a frequency of relaxed satisfaction. You're putting out a frequency of congestion. So that projector is bouncing off the walls. Oh, this undefined throat won't stop talking. That's because the defined throat is not doing their job as a conversationalist. They're not throwing them a rope to keep them from drowning. And so in each of the cases, it's so easy to blame the undefined center that I am very, very skeptical of any situation where the undefined center, no matter how distorted they are. Now, this is again with the caveat that you can be putting out the cleanest frequency in the world, and with the wrong people who are in such a pit of distortion, so locked in their not self, they are going to amplify that and reflect it back to you with the most inhospitable terms. It's going to be like a freak show mirror at the, right. The mirror that completely distorts. At the same time, those undefined centers don't exist in a vacuum, and they don't produce their own energy, unless in the case of electromagnetics. Now, it could very well be that, in this case, your parents have electromagnetics that are causing them to have a sort of feedback loop of distortion, because I have seen that where two undefined center people activate each other through the electromagnetic and end up in a very distorted, very amplified situation. But yeah, I would say, first of all, the manipulation, there is manipulation in the ego, but manipulation is an interesting term because there can be, I guess, a psychological manipulation in one sense, but it actually does take energy to manipulate, and the undefined ego is not going to have that energy consistently the way that the defined ego does. In fact, one of the roles of the defined ego is the manipulation of memory. which is having a very selective memory. And I've seen it again and again where a defined ego person can completely manipulate the memory of a situation to justify their actions. And so that is actually core to how the ego works. Now, it's not to say that the undefined ego won't do that. I have gate 26 in an undefined ego, and gate 26 is actually the gate of manipulation in that sense. It's the taming power of the great. Anytime you see the word taming in a keynote, there's also the taming power of the small, gate 9. That was sort of the Chinese code word for the manipulation of either material things or of, in the case of 26, memory, selective memory, and all of that. So you might want to see if they have gate 26, because that would be misremembering, or remembering with a skewed way that says, well, I never agreed to that, or you told me this, and so on. Yeah, and then as far as scapegoating, it is true that the defined ego gets scapegoated quite a bit, but it's also just, I don't think it was really the case that the original scapegoating was of the defined egos. If you look at where scapegoating comes from, and I can recommend René Girard. He's kind of a cultural anthropologist who has his theory of mimetic desire, which is that all desire is mimesis, meaning it's mind, it's imitated, that we learn how to desire. We don't have these innate desires. It's kind of a social, historically constructed thing. And he has his great theory of scapegoating. He really examines scapegoating in that way. I would also mention Bataille, Theory of Religion, George Bataille. And I would mention Totem and Taboo by Freud as a great text on scapegoating, as well as Fraser's Golden Bough. And so these kind of canonical texts on scapegoating, they really get to where scapegoating came from, and it's actually the beginning of religion and tribalism in kind of 1949 up to 3740. And the scapegoating is actually very fundamental to how the ego operates, which is, again, that tribalism of basically killing and eating something in a sacrificial way. That scapegoating is kind of related to sacrifice. And so, I can definitely see how people can turn on the defined ego, and there can be such a rap about the defined ego and about the rejection of ego, and this almost sort of New Age Buddhist thought that you should never have any ego, or that ego is the enemy, where we do need to disentangle this and see that there is a healthy ego in the sense of healthy resistance to the homogenizing effects of others, that all of us in human design are being challenged to stand up against the world, really. It's an incredible thing if you think about it, to be able to really be ourselves in this world that has such powerful homogenizing influences. So I can see how it can be rejected, but I don't think it's the whole story that the defined ego is scapegoated more than it's actually the principle of scapegoating itself in some sense. And just as we reject scapegoating as such a negative thing, it's also, do you have the stomach to sacrifice? Are you willing to make a sacrifice? Do you have what it takes to sacrifice? And so if we see the connection of scapegoating to sacrifice, there's kind of a deep archetypal resonance there. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mike? Anything on that?
Yeah, I see how that's in the 1949 3740 stream, but then even continuing through the mystic way with the 5125 and the sacrifice that occurs there. It's like if the 1949 is establishing the principles or whatever, and then the 3740 sort of enforcing the rule based on the principles, or putting the principles into action, then whatever, there's that mysterious movement between the gate of aloneness and then the individual circuitry that follows in the mystic way, where it's sort of like after, whether it's the killing of an animal or just the prohibition of something or the exile of something, there's all of a sudden this, this segregation or this remove, and then the person is left alone in that gate of shock, the shock of having to discover for Because eventually then it leads to behavior, right? Towards the end of the mystic way, it gets into behavior. So once you're existing with the tribal rule and then the tribal has left you alone or whatever, fully alone, so alone that you can, then individual circuitry actually comes into play. Then it's like, what are values after that? What are values when you move from the self as a social unit to the self as more of a cosmic unit?
Yeah. Yeah, I want to go into the gates, but I realize that we're already past the top of the hour, so I think what I'm going to do is I will just leave you with the keynotes of the gates that we touched on briefly, some of the keynotes anyway, and then we'll do a study group where we can go more into the gates, and I'm also happy to discover together what the deconditioning process for those with defined egos might be, and maybe hear from people who have a defined ego, like yourself, Amber, as well as others, if they've experienced or what their experience of the undefined ego is. And I think that would be a good study group. So I'll get that scheduled for Friday, probably the same time we did last week. But I do have a lot of notes for the gates, so we'll go through those in the study group. I will just say the keynotes you can kind of explore. That gate 21 is really about control, and one of the keynotes Ra uses is stamina, because it requires so much stamina to maintain control, to have discipline, to have self-control, to be able to control others, to manage others. I mean, this requires a tremendous amount of stamina. So that 21 can really be about stamina, and for the not self of the undefined ego, it can be this complex around not having enough stamina, or having to develop more stamina, making decisions that prove they have the stamina, going on diets or exercise regimens that prove their discipline. Oh, I meditate for 2 hours a day. I get up at 6 a.m. every morning. I don't smoke a cigarette until after 9 p.m. I mean, on and on and on. All of this sort of self-control as a way of proving their value. And then gate 51, this is about guts. And this is having the courage or the bravery, trying to prove their courage, prove their guts. You'll see a lot of undefined egos with a hanging gate 51 who drive across country with only a couple bags in the back of their car, jumping into the void to prove they're not afraid of not knowing where they're going, and so on. You'll see the 26, which is all about convincing. It's the salesperson, it's the marketer, it's the great liar. It's the smarmy, charming ego gate. This is my ego gate, my one ego gate, my undefined center. It's the one that maybe gets less of a bad rap from others. It's kind of the lovable, self-deprecating ego. That 21 really gets a bad rap, because that 21 is just seen as the control freak who will bite you if you try to, do something, right? It's very, it's called biting through. But this 26 is kind of the warm, charming, the Don Draper, right? Don Draper of Mad Men, where the guy says to him, "Mr. Draper, you know what I think of you? You're a smug jerk." And then Don says, "Oh, that's funny. I don't think of you at all." It's that sort of blasé.
Or actually, what the guy says is no, wait. He doesn't he pity him?
Oh,
he's like, he says, "I feel bad for you."
I feel bad for you, because they're like in the elevator, right?
And he says, "I don't think about you at all."
Yeah, I feel bad for you.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. I don't think of you at all. That's my joke is that's like Chicago and New York. You always go to Chicago, they're always talking all this smack about New York.
Yeah.
You go to New York, they're like, Chicago, that's like
where's
somewhere
that again?
in the middle. Is that what state are they in? So, but anyway, that's that sort of 26 kind of. It can be very charming, but it can also be a great liar. This sort of entrepreneurial gate. Ra said of this gate that because he had that as well. That was one of his two ego gates. His personality sun was in gate 51, the gate of shock, the rousing. But he had that gate 26 as well, and he said he was such an entrepreneur he could spit in the desert and make a garden.
Cool, that's good.
And his advice for people with gate 26 is, if you want to tell someone the truth, tell them the second thing you think of saying, not the first. Because the first thing you think of will always be what you think they want to hear. But yeah, this is having the nerve. This is someone comes in to try to sell you something and you end up selling them something.
Right.
That takes some nerve, right? Or they're going to fire you and you end up getting a promotion. Like, how do you rescue victory from the jaws of defeat?
Reframing failures for the sake of empowerment.
And then gate 40 is this gate of aloneness, and the keynote that he gives is capacity, because it's the love of work. So Ra gives the keynote capacity here, and having the capacity to be the provider, to deliver the goods, to bring home the bacon.
You know my high school keynotes for all these, right?
No.
The high school keynotes for 40 are being popular, 26 being cool, 51 being special, and 21 being a boss, being in charge, whatever.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because 2145 is part of that boss channel, the tribal elder.
Yeah.
We could see
Well, and the control thing, self-control, control of a situation. I'm in control.
girl boss,
Yeah.
guy boss, whatever,
Yeah.
yeah. And then 40, so 40 is being popular. That makes sense because it's part of being part of the group. 40, 37 being the part seeking the whole.
And you only are popular because of what you provide for people,
26 is cool because it connects to the spleen.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And,
then
it's just hip and savvy.
Right. It's very
clever.
And it's like new and improved and
Yeah.
like the latest, greatest. Like,
Yeah.
oh, you're still doing it that way. You got to check out this way of doing
Yeah.
it. It's that creative destruction that's always coming up with the new. And then which is 51 again?
Being special.
Interesting, because it's individual.
Yeah, I'm different. Yeah.
Yeah, and it connects to 25, and I like that.
But I mean, high school is just such a great place to see these because no one is competing about something that's not one of these. I mean, in life, obviously, just mechanically, but in high school, the narratives are just so clear. And
Yeah, we really could do a whole human design body graph as high school archetypes.
Yeah, true.
That would be, maybe that's a future project. Okay, well, there's a lot more to say about each of these. We'll save that for the study group. I know we've gone quite long today, but I appreciate you all bearing with me as we go on this. And I think the last question I see, unless there's another I missed, is from Sarah. Sarah asks, she knows making promises is healthy for the defined ego, but what happens when opportunities to make the right promises don't come as often?
for the defined ego?
Yeah. Well, I see making a promise as making a commitment of willpower, and I don't see it as just undiscerning promises. I see it as promises that bring reward or bring the opportunity for reward, or promises that are earned. You don't just get the defined ego to promise you things if you haven't earned it, right? You have to earn their trust. You earn their loyalty. You earn their value so that they will promise you, and that is part of it. Now, as far as opportunities to make the right promises, I don't see that as a problem. I mean, what it really is about is how are you using your energy, and I guess you will have opportunities to make promises when you have people in your life who support you, who meet your needs,
Right.
who are loyal to you, who you are loyal to, who you support, whose needs you meet. I mean, these are the tribal bonds. We don't just make promises to strangers. We don't make promises for no reason.
Right.
We make promises because we have trust, and trust has to be earned.
And as we saw on the slide with the lion, it is the vast majority of time is the rest. The lion sleeps for 20 hours a day and spends 4 days hunting. So when the ego snaps into action in order to prove something or accomplish something or follow something through to its end, that's going to be the one kill it makes a day.
Yeah, right. It can work once and profit forever. Or it's kind of like part of leadership being nobody remembers the years that pass when you don't need to save the day, but when you actually do save it, then they all laud you as a hero.
I think a worthy promise is always going to be rare, no matter how correctly you're living.
That's a good point.
Opportunity for a worthy promise.
And I see Sarah's comment here. It surprised her to learn she has a defined ego, as she had low self-esteem and also had a hard time both fulfilling promises and asking and getting paid for her worth. Then she started experimenting with strategy and authority and discovered the issue as those promises were never hers to make. So yeah, that's very much a part of it. And also the defined ego, I mean, if you really do have their trust and they confide in you, they'll tell you, it's not that they have an innate sense that what they have has value as much as they, it's kind of like there can be a real self-esteem issue there as well. It's kind of like the idea that true courage is not someone who's unafraid, it's someone who's afraid and does it anyway. That they've overcome their fear. So that healthy self-esteem is not someone who only has healthy self-esteem, is that they've overcome the low self-esteem to see if what they do has value anyway. So there can be a real negative self-esteem of the defined ego, and it's also because so many of them are so beaten down because they're not getting the rewards from life, because people aren't petting them, aren't massaging them, aren't nourishing them, nurturing them, feeding them, doting on them, caring for them. I mean, the defined ego has a built-in mechanism where these things are naturally translated. It's like a natural translation between layers of the Maya that just doesn't exist for the undefined ego. There's that great, curious quote from Hegel where he says, "The spirit is a bone." And it's this weird conflation of the immaterial with the material. And that's something we see with the body graph, where there are ways of translating the immaterial to the material. And so the defined ego translates a literal massage or a nice meal made with love or any of these so-called love languages and things like that into life force energy, that it actually does nourish them at a physical and metaphysical level. And that nourishment directly impacts their self-esteem, but their self-esteem is not a permanent condition. It is a level, and it'll lower and diminish. It sort of burns, right?
Right.
So.
And it's funny that the channel connecting the ego to the center of the spirit, the G center, is the channel of consecration, of things having a material and metaphysical coincidence of significance.
Well, I'm going to leave this with one last little poetic moment from Ra, and we'll look at this more when we go into the gates in our study group on Friday. But he talks about Gate 51 and how Gate 51 is the gallbladder. It's the gall. We were talking about bravery. The courage, the bravery, the gall of the fool to leap into the void, and it's also the bile, so it can have a lot of bile. But interestingly, people get stones. You know, they get gallstones, or they get and there's a funny thing that Ross said. He said also there's that saying, the heart of stone, and a heart that's closed off to people, and a heart that's turned to stone, right? The stone-hearted person. And he said that actually this is what happens when the ego is disconnected from the G center. That Gate 51 powers universal love. It is the power for universal love.
Right.
And so that 51 connects to the 25 to that gate of universal love. And he said that if the ego doesn't have enough universal love, if it can't broaden itself to power that universal love, to fuel that universal love, it turns to stone. So that's just something we can think about. And next week we'll be looking at the G center, so we can look more into that. But for this week, we'll continue our deep dive into the heart center. Thank you all for being with us on this journey, and I'll make sure to get a study group scheduled where we can go deeper into the gates. And thank you all. It's been a great time spending this time with you. Thank you.